The morning she bought them, it was a Tuesday, the second Tuesday of June in 2019, and the sky over the valley was the color of a bruise going yellow at the edges, which is the color the sky gets after 3 days of rain when it can't quite decide whether it's finished. I remember it clearly because I'd driven Ruth into town for feed, and we passed the roadside stand where old Delbert Hutchins sold his sweet cherries every summer, and there she was, my wife, standing in front of 60 crates of cherries that had split their skins open in the rain, every one of them cracked and weeping juice. And Delbert, looking like a man who'd already given up on them, she had her arms crossed and her chin set the way it gets when she's already decided something and is only pretending to think about it. I stayed in the truck. I've been married to that woman long enough to know when I am not part of the transaction. What I could see through the windshield was Delbert waving one hand at the crates like he was shooing off flies, and Ruth nodding slow, and then she pulled her little coin purse out of her jacket and counted something into his palm, and he laughed the kind of laugh a man laughs when he thinks he's just put one over on somebody. $9. That's what she paid for all 60 crates. $9 for the whole ruined lot, and Delbert practically helped her load them into the bed of the truck himself, glad to be rid of them before they turned. I asked her when she climbed back in and shut the door what in the world she planned to do with 60 crates of split cherries, because a split cherry doesn't ship, doesn't store, doesn't sit on a shelf pretty at the market, and by Thursday they'd be a puddle of fermented mush drawing every yellow jacket in the county. And she looked out the windshield at the wet road and said, "Plain as anything, that a cherry that's already broken open is a cherry that's ready to give you everything it has." I didn't know yet what she knew. I'll own that. I thought I'd married a practical woman, and a practical woman does not spend money, even $9 of it, on fruit that is actively falling apart in the bed of a truck. But I let it go, because you learn which fights the land and the woman will let you win. And this was not going to be one of them. What I didn't understand, sitting there with the wipers going and the smell of overripe cherry already filling the cab, was that Ruth was not looking at 60 crates of garbage. She was looking at something her own grandmother had left her, and she'd been waiting a long, quiet while for the chance to use it. Now I've farmed this ground for 41 years, and Ruth people farmed the hollow one ridge over before that, going back further than either of us can name with any certainty. Her grandmother, a woman named Opal that I met exactly twice before she passed in the winter of 1988, 31 years before that bruised Tuesday, was known in that hollow for her preserves, though nobody outside a few families ever tasted them, because Opal didn't sell. She'd put up jam every summer, in whatever jars she had, and she'd hand them out at church, and at funerals, and to any young mother who looked worn thin, and that was the whole of her business. Which is to say she had no business at all, only a habit of feeding people. When she died, most of what she owned got scattered the way things do, but Ruth kept one thing, a wooden crate of odds and ends from the back of Opal's pantry. And in that crate, under a stack of dish towels gone gray with age, was a composition notebook with a marbled black and white cover, the corners soft as cloth, while the spine held together with a strip of tape that had long ago lost its stick. Ruth kept that notebook in a drawer for 31 years, from the winter Opal passed to that June morning. She'd take it out now and again. I'd seen her do it. Sit at the kitchen table with the cup going cold, and turn the pages slow, and I never thought much about it. The way you don't think much about the things your spouse does that don't cost you anything. But I'll tell you now what I found out later, which is that Ruth had read that notebook so many times she could recite it, and that there was one line in it that had been sitting in her like a seed sits in cold ground, waiting for the right spring. I didn't ask about the notebook. That Tuesday, I asked about the cherries, and she didn't answer beyond what she'd already said. And by the time we got home, the rain had let up and the sun was trying to come through weak and watery, and she backed the truck up to the summer kitchen, which is the little building off the back porch that we don't use for much anymore. And she started carrying crates in 2 at a time. I helped, because I'm not the kind of man who watches his wife carry crates, but I helped the way you help with something you think is foolish. Which is to say, I did the work and kept my opinion loud in my own head. The cherries were worse up close. Better than half of them had gone soft, and the juice ran red-purple down the sides of the crate and dripped through the slats and stained the concrete floor of the summer kitchen, a color it never fully lost. It smelled like a wine cellar and a fruit stand had gotten into a fight. And Ruth stood in the middle of all of it, with her hands on her hips, and looked as pleased as I'd seen her in years. That evening after supper she brought the notebook out to the porch where I was sitting, and she set it in my lap without a word, and she told me to read the page she'd marked with a strip of the same gray dish towel. So I did. Opal's hand was small and careful, the letters leaning all one way like grass in a steady wind, and the pencil had gone brown with the years. Most of the page was a recipe, or the bones of one, ingredients listed with amounts that assumed you already knew what you were doing, cherries and sugar and the juice of lemons, and a note about skimming the foam. But down at the bottom, underlined twice, and with a little question mark after it that Opal had never crossed out, was one line, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it said, because it matters. It said, "The split ones make the best." That was it. The split ones make the best, underlined twice, with a question mark. As if Opal herself had suspected something she never quite let herself prove. And Ruth looked at me, reading it, and she said her grandmother had told her once, when she was a girl of maybe 9 or 10, that the cherries the market threw away made the finest preserves of all, because a cherry that breaks in the rain has already started letting go of its water. And a cherry that's let go of its water is nothing but concentrated flavor and pectin waiting to set. But Opal never got to test it proper, Ruth said, because Opal took whatever cherries she could get and never had the luxury of buying up a whole ruined lot to find out. And so that line sat in the notebook for 31 years with its little question mark, unanswered, a thing the dead woman had wondered and never settled. And Ruth had decided, some private morning I never knew about, that she was going to settle it. Now, I want to be honest about my reasons for telling you all this the slow way, because I could jump ahead to how it turned out, but the getting there is the point, and I'd be doing you and Ruth both a disservice to rush it. What I felt, sitting on that porch, holding a dead woman's notebook, was not belief. I'll say that plain. I thought Opal had been a kind woman with a sentimental idea, and I thought my wife had spent $9 and was about to spend a great deal more in sugar and jars and time chasing a girlhood memory. But I have learned in 41 years of farming that the things you're sure won't work are exactly the things you should watch closely. Because the ground and the seasons have humbled me too many times for me to trust my own certainty. So I watched. The next morning Ruth was in the summer kitchen before I'd had my coffee, and she had the big copper kettle out, the one that had been her mother's, and she was pitting cherries by hand, thousands of them, her fingers going purple to the second knuckle, and she'd worked out a system where she'd sort as she went. The ones that had gone truly bad into a slop bucket for the hogs, the ones that were only split and soft into the kettle. She told me the split ones were losing their water fast now, and that if she'd waited even 2 more days, it would have been too late, and that this was why nobody did it. Because the window between a cherry being worth saving and a cherry being garbage is about 72 hours wide. And you can't run a business on a 72-hour window unless you're standing right there the moment the rain stops. She cooked that first batch slow, over a low fire, skimming the foam the way Opal's note said, and she didn't add near as much sugar as the recipe called for because she said the concentrated fruit didn't need it, and she was watching for the set with a cold saucer, dripping a bit of the hot jam onto the chilled china and tilting it to see if it wrinkled. It took most of the day. By evening she had 31 jars lined up on the summer kitchen counter, and they'd sealed with that little pop the lids make when the vacuum takes, and the color of them. I have to tell you, the color was not like any jam I'd seen. Dorch jam is bright, almost fake-looking. This was dark. Nearly the color of the sky had been that Tuesday, a deep, brooding red-black that caught the light and held it. She wouldn't let me taste it that night. She said it had to rest. That jam needs to sit and think about itself for a few days before it's honest. And that made me laugh, but she was serious. So we left the 31 jars to think, and we went to bed. And I lay there in the dark listening to my wife breathe, and thinking that whatever else was true, I'd married a woman who could turn $9 of ruined fruit into 31 jars of something, and that was its own kind of miracle, even if the something turned out to be no good. Word gets around a small place faster than you'd credit. By the end of that week, somebody had seen Ruth buying up Delbert's ruined cherries, and by noon the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown the way they do. So that by the time it came back around to us, it was that Ruth Callahan had lost her mind and bought a truckload of rotten fruit and was cooking it in the yard like a witch over a fire. Delbert himself came by that Saturday, driving that truck of his that he keeps so clean you could eat off the hood, which has always struck me as a strange thing for a man who sells fruit out of the dirt to care about. And he leaned on his door with the window down and asked me, friendly enough, whether Ruth had figured out yet that a rotten cherry is a rotten cherry, no matter how you cook it. He wasn't cruel about it. Delbert's not a cruel man. He was just certain, the way people get certain about things they've never actually tried. And he said he'd been selling cherries for going on 30 years, and he'd never once heard of anybody wanting to split ones, and that there was a reason for that, and the reason was that they were no good. I told him Ruth was farming. That's all I said. I said she was farming, which is what she was doing, only with a copper kettle instead of a plow, and Delbert laughed and said he'd never heard cooking called farming, and he drove off, and his truck didn't kick up any dust because the road was still damp, and I stood there a while looking after him. The county extension had a woman come out that same week, not for the cherries, for something else entirely, a question I'd had about a soil test on the north field, but while she was there, she saw the summer kitchen and all those jars in the stained floor, and she asked what we were up to, and Ruth told her, and the extension woman, who was young and earnest and had a clipboard and a clean quilted jacket with the extension logo on it, got a careful look on her face and told Ruth kindly that home canning of overripe fruit carried a real risk, that split fruit spoils fast and can harbor mold you can't see, and that if Ruth was thinking of selling any of it, she'd need to be very careful about her acidity and her processing times. And she quoted a figure. She said that something like 19 out of 20 small food operations that started up in the county failed inside 2 years, and she said it the way you say a thing that's meant to end the conversation. And it did end that conversation, because Ruth just thanked her and said she'd be careful. And the woman drove off, and she'd meant well, she truly had, but she'd looked at those jars for about 90 seconds and never once asked to taste one. And that's the whole difference right there, between the people who tell you a number and the people who taste the thing. The jars rested 4 days. On the 5th morning, Ruth opened one at breakfast and spread it on a piece of bread she'd toasted, and she handed it to me without a word, and I ate it, and I want to tell you honestly what happened in my mouth, because it changed how I understood the whole business. It did not taste like jam. It tasted like the idea of a cherry. Like every cherry I'd ever eaten had been a rough draft, and this was the finished thing. It was dark and deep, and there was a tartness under the sweet that store jam has beaten out of it, and it wasn't cloying. It didn't coat your teeth. It just filled up the whole back of your mouth and stayed there like a good memory. I didn't say anything for a bit. Ruth watched me not say anything, and then she said, "That's what opal meant. That's what she wondered about her whole life and never got to know. The split ones make the best." And I understood finally that my wife hadn't bought $9 of garbage. She'd bought the answer to a dead woman's question, and the answer was yes. We took a dozen jars to the church that Sunday, not to sell. Ruth wouldn't hear of selling at church, but to give, the way Opal used to, and something happened that I don't think either of us fully expected. People who tasted it came back around asking where they could get more, and not the polite asking people do to be kind, but real asking, the kind with money already half out of the pocket. A woman named Carol Pruitt, who runs the little bakery in town and knows more about what people will pay for than anyone in that county, tasted a spoonful of it standing right there in the fellowship hall. And she went quiet. I saw it happen. She had a whole sentence started, something light and social. And she stopped in the middle of it, and she looked down at the spoon, and then she looked up at Ruth, and said one word. She said, "Exceptional." That was all. A woman who talks for a living, and she found one word and stopped. She asked Ruth to bring some by the bakery, said she'd sell it on consignment and split it fair, and she was talking fast now the way people do when they've decided something and want to lock it in before you change your mind. So the next week, Ruth brought Carol 24 jars, and Carol put them on the counter by the register, with a little card that said local, small batch, and priced them at $9 a jar, which struck me as a number, the sense of humor to it. $9 a jar for jam made from $9 of fruit, and I said as much. Those 24 jars sold out before noon of the first day. Carol called that evening and asked for more, and Ruth told her the truth, which was that there wasn't any more that she'd used near all of Delbert's cherries and had maybe 40 jars left to her name. And she wasn't giving those up, because some of them were spoken for, and some of them she wanted to keep to see how they aged. And Carol said something then that mattered. She said that she'd had customers ask if they could put their name down for the next batch. And Ruth said there wasn't going to be a next batch until next June when the rains came again, and Carol said she'd take names anyway. And she did. She started a list, a plain-lined pad by the register, and people wrote their names and how many jars they wanted, and by the time we got to the 4th of July, 3 weeks after that Tuesday, that list had over 40 names on it, and jars promised into the next summer that didn't exist yet. My wife had a waitlist for jam she couldn't make until it rained again. I want to slow down here and tell you about the part that convinced me all the way past any doubt. Because a bakery selling out and a list of names could be a fashion, a thing people want because other people want it, and I've lived long enough to be suspicious of that. There was a man, an older fellow, drove up from 2 counties south who bought and sold specialty foods, sold them to fine restaurants and shops in the city, and he'd heard about Ruth's cherry preserves from a cousin who'd gotten a jar, and he came out to the farm on a hot, still afternoon in the middle of July to taste it and see if it was worth his trouble. He was a serious man, not unkind, but not warm, either the kind who's tasted 10,000 jars of jam and isn't going to be impressed by yours just because you're nice. Ruth sat him at the kitchen table and opened a jar and gave him a clean spoon and didn't say a word to sell it, because she'd learned by then that the jam sold itself and talking over it only got in the way. He took a small spoonful. He held it in his mouth a long moment, with his eyes down at the table, the way a man does when he's listening to something. Then he took another, larger. And then he set the spoon down and he was quiet, and the quiet went on long enough that I started to worry. And Ruth just sat there, patient as the ground itself. And finally the man looked up and he said one thing. He said in a low voice that he'd tasted cherry preserves from every part of this country and a good many others, and that he'd never once had one with this much of the fruit still in it, and that he didn't know how she'd gotten the water out without cooking the life out of it. That's the whole thing, right there. Water out, life in. And he'd figured it in 3 spoonfuls, what the extension woman never asked, and Delbert never believed. Ruth told him. She didn't hold it back like a secret. She told him the cherries came split, that the rain had already started the work, that by the time she got them the water was going, and the flavor was staying, and that all she did was finish what the weather began. And the man nodded slow, and he said, the word substantial, and he said there was a substantial market for something like this if she could make enough, and there was the rub, because she could only make it when it rained on cherries at the right moment in the right week, which is to say she couldn't make it on demand for love or money. And I watched him understand that. Watched him realize that the very thing that made it good was the thing that made it rare, and that the rareness wasn't a flaw in the business, it was the business. He left that day with the 2 jars Ruth would part with, and a promise to buy every jar she could make the following summer at a price I won't repeat here, except to say it was a great deal more than $9. And it made the consignment shelf at Carol's look like the charity it partly was. Now Delbert came back around in August. I'd wondered if he would. His truck came up the road, clean as ever, and he pulled up to the fence where I was mending a section that the cattle had leaned over. And he sat there a minute with the engine idling before he said anything. He'd heard, of course. Everyone had heard by then, the way they hear. And he wasn't a man to make a big speech about being wrong, Delbert, and I wouldn't have wanted him to. He just looked out over the field. And then he looked at me, and he said that he'd been throwing out the split ones for 30 years. He said it flat, like a fact. He was turning over 30 years of split cherries fed to hogs, or left to rot in the rain. And he asked, not quite meeting my eye, whether Ruth might want to buy his rain-split cherries again next summer, if it rained. And I told him she surely would, and that she'd pay him fair for them too, more than $9, and he nodded at that, and he said, well, and then he didn't say anything else. And he put the truck in gear, and before he pulled off he said, quiet, that Opal had given him a jar of her jam once, back when he was a young man and his first wife had passed, and that he'd forgotten all about it until now, and that maybe he shouldn't have laughed. And then he drove off, and the road was dry that day, and his truck kicked up a little dust that hung gold in the afternoon light before it settled. I stood there at the fence a long time after he'd gone. I've thought about that summer a good deal in the years since, because it changed something in how I look at my own certainty. I'd been so sure. I'd sat in that truck on that bruised Tuesday morning, absolutely certain that my wife had wasted $9. And I'd been wrong in about the biggest way a man can be wrong, which is to say I'd been wrong about what a thing was worth. Because the cherries weren't worth $9, Delbert didn't undercharge her. In the only market either of us knew, the market of shipping and shelving and looking pretty at a stand, those split cherries were worth exactly nothing. Worth less than nothing. Worth the cost of hauling them off. But there's more than one market, and there's more than one kind of worth, and Ruth knew a market that didn't exist yet, because she was carrying it in her head from a notebook a dead woman left her. Opal wondered her whole life whether the split ones made the best, and she died with the question mark still on the end of it, and 31 years later her granddaughter answered it with a copper kettle and a cold saucer and a stubbornness she got from that same hollow. I think about the extension woman sometimes too, and I hold no grudge. She was doing her job, and her caution was real and mostly right, 19 out of 20. Small food operations probably do fail, and Ruth's could have been one of them. But her number was a number about the general run of things, and Ruth wasn't the general run of things. And the woman would have known that if she'd stayed long enough to taste one jar, instead of counting the jars from the doorway. That's the thing about a number that's meant to end. A conversation, it ends the conversation and then it goes home, and it never finds out it was wrong. Ruth still makes the jam. It's been 6 summers now, and some years it rains right, and some years it doesn't, and the years it doesn't, there's no jam at all. And the wait list just gets longer, and the people wait, because a thing you can't have whenever you want is a thing you learn to wait for. She's never scaled it up the way the man from 2 counties south would have liked, because there's no way to. You can't make it rain on Delbert's cherries in the 3rd week of June, and Ruth decided a long while back that she'd rather make a little of something honest than a lot of something forced. She keeps the notebook in a drawer in the summer kitchen now instead of the bedroom, out where she can reach it, and the marbled cover has gotten softer still. And she's added to it, her own hand next to Opal's, pencil notes about which years the rain came right and how the set went and what the man in the city paid. And down at the bottom of Opal's page, under the 2 underlines and the question mark that the old woman never crossed out, Ruth wrote one thing in her own careful hand a few summers back. She wrote, "Yes, they do." Just that. Yes, they do. Answering a question that had waited 31 years to be answered, from one woman of that hollow to another, across the distance the dead keep from the living, which is not so far as you'd think when there's a notebook in between. I read it not long ago standing in the summer kitchen while Ruth skimmed the foam off a batch, and I had to go outside for a minute. And I told her it was the smell of the cherries getting in my eyes. And she let me have that, because she's kind. And because she knew it wasn't the cherries. So that's the story of how my wife bought 60 crates of ruined fruit for $9 on a Tuesday in June, and had people lined up waiting on her by the 4th of July. And it isn't really a story about jam, though. The jam is good, better than good. It's a story about the fact that most of the things the world throws away have been thrown away by people who never once tried them, who were certain, the way Delbert was certain, and I was certain, and the extension woman was certain, and certainty is a comfortable place to stand right up until the ground moves under you. There is worth in things that aren't in fashion, and aren't in season, and don't ship, and don't store, and don't look like much in the bed of a truck. And there is a particular kind of gift in the knowledge the old people leave us, the notes in the margins, the things they wondered and never got to prove because a question left for you is a kind of trust. It says, I couldn't finish this, but I think you might. Opal trusted Ruth with a question. Ruth trusted $9 against a whole town's certainty. And the rain which broke those cherries open and ruined them for every use but the one that mattered turned out to know something all of us had missed, which is that a thing that's already broken open is a thing that's ready to give you everything it has. I've come to believe the woman was right about that, and about a good deal else besides. If you've got your own piece of ruined fruit, your own split cherries, some overlooked and thrown away thing that everybody was certain was worthless right up until somebody bothered to taste it, I'd truly like to hear about it down in the comments, because I've found there are more of these stories than you'd guess, and they're worth passing around. And if this one meant something to you, if it put you in mind of somebody who left you a question you're still trying to answer, go ahead and subscribe, and stick around, because we move slow on this channel. But we get there, same as the jam, same as the ground, same as everything worth waiting on.